Our first speaker is one of my personal heroes along the way. He has been writing early, often, and eloquently about the environment in general and about climate change as well. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, was really the seminal book for a wide audience about climate change. It's been published in 24 languages now. He's a founding fellow of the Sanders Institute, founder of 350.org, which is a grassroots effort to attack climate change, which apparently is the only way something is going to happen when it comes to climate change, given inaction we see at other levels. The Boston Globe has called him probably the most important environmentalist in our country, and we are very honored to have Bill McKibben here. Please give him a warm welcome.
Miles, thank you much. It is a pleasure to be with you all and a pleasure to be at WGBH. I'm so old that I was from the original, I watched Zoom when it was in its, not the remake, the original incarnation. I'm so old growing up in Boston that, Mr. Abbott, I can well remember your predecessor, David Ives, in his apron running the Channel 2 auction. So it's really fun to be back here. Linda, thank you for the invitation. This continues to be a thriving and important place. I get every few months get to go on the air with Jim and Marjorie and talk with them and sort of have some sense of the pulse of this place. And now, thank heaven, my daughter is at work here too, across the street helping run the podcast documentary for Frontline Dispatch. Their new season debuts in a week, which means she's much too busy to come hear her dad. But you should all listen to it because it's great. Very good idea to put me on first here, because you're going to get the really depressing and impossible stuff out of the way, and then you can go to work on the bright and cheerful ideas for remaking the world. I confess I really don't have those to give you right now. This is an extraordinarily difficult stretch of time for trying to think positively, at least about climate change. And I'll try to tell you why briefly and then tell you what, if anything, we can do about it. Probably most of you saw the coverage that came out of the IPCC report when it was published 2 weeks ago. This is essentially the same report that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been issuing since the mid-1990s. Every 5 years, the world scientists provide a new take on it, and it hasn't changed in any fundamental way. What's changed is that it's 25 years later, and we've done nothing, and so the slope that we must plummet down has become extraordinarily steep if we're to do anything about climate change. I see Bill Muma in the audience, who's almost the only person around who's worked as long on this issue as I have, and Tim Weiskell too. And one of the things I think all of us struggle to avoid doing is say from time to time, oh, if only you'd listened to us then. Because 30 years ago, there were actually a number of relatively gentle and easy trajectories out of this problem. Those are gone now. And if we're going to meet the mandates of physics, then we have no choice but to change with enormous speed. And of course, that's all the more difficult in a world where most of the political avenues for easy change are now closed off because of the people and parties that we've been putting in power, not just here, but increasingly around the globe. It's not in this case that we lack ideas about what to do. We know more or less what we need to do. We need to stop burning coal and gas and oil because the carbon that is emitted traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. We know now, in a way that we didn't 30 years ago, what we would replace those things with. The engineers have done their job with vengeance. We've watched over the last decade as the price of a solar panel has plummeted, dropped 90%. Now in most of the world, the cheapest way that you can generate electricity is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. Wind power, similarly. The cheapest electrons on Earth are coming from those spinning turbine blades. And so there is no technological barrier anymore. And there are people who have put these insights and others to work in all kinds of good ways. In the course of 10 minutes drinking coffee today, I was talking with people who are building passive house solar designs, people who are doing insulating and repairing commercial buildings to reduce their energy efficiency, to reduce their energy use. These things are not hard even at this point. They're things that we know how to do. And if we had 50 years or 75 years, then the natural and gradual evolution in those directions would take us where we need to go. Our problem, of course, is that we don't have 50 or 75 years. 50 or 75 years from now, the planet is going to run on solar power and wind energy because in the long run, free is a very difficult proposition to beat, okay? Our problem is that on current trajectories, the world that we run on sun and wind in 50 or 75 years is going to be a fundamentally broken planet. And if we wanted to change that, if we wanted to make this happen more quickly, then we would need to change what we're doing now. Above all, we would need to figure out how to break the political power of the fossil fuel industry, the richest industry on Earth, and one that is clearly willing, in an effort to maintain its business model for another decade or two, to break the planet. And that's precisely what's going on. You've watched over the last few years this happen. We came out of Paris climate negotiations in December of 2015 with as close a claim to optimism as we've had during the global warming era. The agreement itself was not sufficient to deal with the problems that we faced, but it augured a certain momentum, and our hope was that we could build very quickly on it. And as the countries began the process of complying with the pledges they'd made in Paris, they would discover that it was easier and cheaper than they had thought, and we would be in a virtuous cycle that would speed this transition. Instead, what we've gotten is the exact opposite. In this country, the fossil fuel industry, fighting as they have for 30 years to defeat reality, managed to help elect a president who, as one of his first acts, withdrew the United Nations from those Paris Accords. The list of truly shameful and disgraceful things that we've done in this country over the last few years is long, but historians, I think, may treat that as just about the summit, that the country that's poured more carbon into the atmosphere than any other is now the only country on the planet that is unwilling to participate in the effort, international effort, to do anything about it should shame us all. We won't be alone in this for much longer. The man who was elected president of Brazil 36 hours ago has promised that that country too will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. Indeed, he has announced that he is removing all protections for land in the Amazon, the lungs of the planet, taking away the protections that have been granted indigenous communities to whom that land rightfully belongs. And that presages an assault on that forest whose continued operation we need if we're to have any hope of keeping the planet's climate under control. But you can see it in less spectacular things every day. I've been on the road for weeks now campaigning for candidates and ballot measures in the run-up to the midterm elections, and it's truly horrifying and disgusting to watch what's going on. I was in Washington State, where there is a modest carbon tax on the ballot, one supported by a broad measure of people, from frontline communities and communities of color in Washington to Bill Gates. And yet it's almost certain to go down to defeat because the fossil fuel industry has poured in tens of millions of dollars. BP alone spent $10 million to defeat this very modest carbon tax. I was in Colorado the next day, where people have asked not to ban fracking, merely on this ordinance to require people who are going to drill for oil to be more than a couple of thousand feet from people's homes and schools. That modest ask has so inflamed the fossil fuel industry that they've poured $38 million into the state. They're outspending the community groups that are fighting for this ballot measure 40-1. You cannot turn on the TV without, I mean, they've bought up every available piece of airtime. They've got so much money that they're reduced to driving trucks up and down the highways of Colorado, towing mobile billboards filled with their lies about this proposal. The question of how you manage to break the political power of that industry is the only interesting question that we have when it comes to climate change, the only unsolved question that we have. We understand the science of climate change. We understand most of the solutions that we need. We can talk about them all day, but it does no good to talk about them until we've broken that political power. And so that's what we try to do. History indicates that the only alternative currency to money that sometimes works is the currency of movements, of people coming together to build the kind of movements large enough to, in the end, shift the zeitgeist of the planet. And if one can shift the zeitgeist, then one perhaps can change the politics in time to begin to catch up the physics. So that's what we try to do. At 350.org, which we founded a decade ago, we've now organized about 20,000 demonstrations in every corner of the world except North Korea. We've involved religious communities in a huge way for the first time in this work. That's just to give you an example. That's Jordan and Palestine and Israel on the same day, with people coming together around the edges of the Dead Sea, which has shrunk alarmingly as the temperature has warmed. Those are your brothers and sisters in the Maldives, in the Indian Ocean, holding their meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate the existential problem that faces parts of the world where people live only a few meters above sea level. We have done this in every way that we can think of to do. 350 is the safe level of CO2 in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million, a number sadly we're already way north of. 410 parts per million today and going up about 3 parts per million per year. That's why the Arctic is melting. That's why our great forests now catch on fire with regularity. That's why we see droughts like we've never seen before. That's why we see temperatures that we've never seen before. 2018 was the warmest summer in human history. Place after place managed to set all-time heat records. We think the highest reliably recorded temperatures ever measured on planet Earth. There were cities last summer where for days the temperature topped 129 degrees Fahrenheit, really past the point where humans over the long term have any business living and surviving. And so we do this over and over again, and I can show you these pictures all day and all night, and it's been wonderful and powerful and built great alliances, and we're at the point where we should be making, that's one of those dry riverbeds in the Southwest. We hired a satellite one day to do these great art projects around the planet. They called it the biggest day of art in the planet's history. When the satellite came over Santa Fe, 2,000 or 3,000 people organized by the Santa Fe Art Institute put blue blankets over her head just to bring that river back to life for a second, okay? In a rational world, perhaps all this would be enough, but that's not the world in which we live, so we now engage in all kinds of other actions. These are a few shots from the beginning of the fight against the Keystone Pipeline. You're going to hear from one of the great activists in the planet in a minute, Tara Huska, who's going to tell you about some of these other fights that are underway that draw on and are similar to this work, and they happen everywhere. There's not a pipeline, there's not a coal mine, there's not a frack well on the planet now that isn't fought and contested, and we win some of these fights and we lose some, but the overall work is powerful and impressive. But whether it's happening in time or not, I can't begin to tell you, because so much of the time now we're seeing the effects just kind of overwhelm us. These are our colleagues up in Siberia. You know, we're now seeing forest fires routinely 4 and 5 degrees of latitude north of where we ever saw them before, because the forests have become so hot and dried out. These are people who are leaving their homes in Micronesia, forced to evacuate because the water has risen too high. These are people in the part of Pakistan that had the greatest flood since Noah in 2010, when the Indus, after record rainfall, overflowed to the point that 1/4 of the country was underwater and 20 million people had to evacuate their homes. And if you look at them for a second, you're privy to the other great truth of climate change, which is the people who have done the least to cause it are the ones who get hit first and hardest, okay? I'm going to leave you, let's see if I can, well, there's a picture that always is powerful to me. It's a tiny little demonstration in a tiny provincial corner of Haiti, but what gets me is what the signs that those kids are holding say. Your actions affect me, which is absolutely true. That town done next year, that city, like Cayes, was wiped off the face of the map by a hurricane. 80% of its housing stock destroyed. I have no idea if those kids are still alive. Your actions affect me, but not vice versa. There's really not much that people in Haiti can do to affect the outcome of this story. They can't burn less fossil fuel because they're not burning any now. And they can't go to the White House and sit in because we don't let people into this country for purposes like that. And they can't do things like divest their holdings in fossil fuel because they don't have any. It's places like this that have any, and it's why it should make us absolutely sick that institutions like, say, Harvard College down the road with the biggest endowment of any institution on earth refuses to, continues to buy stock in fossil fuel companies and defend the status quo. All their protestations to the side. So people now fight and fight everywhere, and it's been beautiful to be a part of that fight and get to see it up close, to see the fact that indigenous communities and frontline communities are leading it and doing the most powerful work and doing it in every part of the planet. These are our brothers and sisters in the South Pacific, in islands like Tuvalu, the Marshalls, Micronesia, the Solomons, Vanuatu, that may not make it out of this century. But their slogan is, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And it's beautiful to watch that. 2 years, 3 years ago, each of those countries built a traditional canoe, and they took them off to Newcastle in Australia, and they used them to blockade the largest coal port in the world for a day. And the pictures that come back should give you some sense of what this fight looks like, literally looks like. What it looks like, and this is a trope that fits well in human brains, is the fight of the small and the many against the big and the few. This is the rebel alliance against the Death Star, okay, quite literally. And it is a picture we see and an image we see repeated around the world. That was the same summer in Seattle. That big 40-story drilling rig over there was one that Shell wanted to take into the Arctic to start drilling for oil in the American Arctic for the first time. Think about that for a minute. The world's climate scientists had told us that if we kept doing what we were doing, we would melt the Arctic. Indeed, they turned out to be correct. Did groups like Shell Oil look at that and think, maybe we should go into the solar panel business instead? They did not. They looked at that and said, now it'll be easier to drill for more oil in the Arctic. That makes one wonder whether the human brain was a good adaptation or not, I think. Happily, there were plenty of people with big brains connected to big hearts that were willing to get in the way. Thousands of people in small craft took to the harbor. We called them kayaktivists. And before the summer was done, Shell decided it couldn't sustain the brand damage that was underway and pulled out of its plans to drill in the Arctic. Although people are headed back into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge next week to begin the process of prospecting for oil. We need, so this is where I end, just to say there is no magic idea. There's no great solution beyond the solution of people figuring out how to stand up to the brute power that is represented by the concentration of money in the fossil fuel industry. If we cannot do that, then we cannot win this fight. There is nothing that individuals can do as individuals at this point. My house is covered with solar panels. I'm happy for it, but I do not try to fool myself that it is doing anything to end climate change. The only thing that will is if individuals figure out how to become somewhat less individual and join together in movements large enough to change the basic zeitgeist on this planet. It's the biggest challenge that humans have ever come up against. So far, we are failing that challenge. Let's hope that people like Tara will be able to figure out how to move us through into the next phase. Thank you very much.